Hey there, it's Darren, and welcome to episode 3, chapter 2 of my book, my project called The Story. The title of this episode is The Childhood, and I really hope that you enjoy it. So, I want to start out by really bringing up this question: what is a childhood? I mean, I know that we all have our own definition of that, and obviously the English language tells us what a childhood is, but more than just like what is it, why do we hold them as so significant? Each of us has a childhood story, a collection of stories, and I really believe that it's because they make us who we are today. Our childhoods, in whatever way, contributed to where we are, how we are, whether we've let it win, lose, have power over us, everyone has a childhood story. And one thing that I have really discovered looking back on my childhood is not just that I have all these stories, but I can look back and I can actually see how similar I was as a little kid to how I am now. It's really fascinating. I was an individual little guy back then in the same way that I'm an individual grown-up guy today. So I want to tell you a little bit about what little Darren was like now, and especially as a kid. So I want to start out by saying that I was so easily fascinated and just truly entertained by the simplest things. One of my earliest memories that I can remember, we had this wiener dog. His name was Fritz. And I'll never forget being a little boy and my parents brought home a girl, Fritz. And her name was Sassy. She was obviously a female dachshund. But I remember coming out of my bedroom, my parents said there was a surprise, and there were two Fritzes. They looked the same, and I couldn't get over it for forever. And I've always been just so easily entertained by the simplest things. I also really learned how to just be entertained. My mom was very funny growing up. She was always laughing and impersonating and telling jokes, and it was just something we did. We were kind of always laughing. So that's one of my first things I realized. Second is I've always been pretty resourceful, and I was an especially resourceful kid. I remember being a youngin', and I wanted to ride my grandpa's riding lawnmower. I wanted to ride it so bad. But I was little, and I didn't weigh all that much. And so when I sat down on the seat, it wasn't weighted down enough to go. And I wasn't going to stand for that. So I remember finding these old paint cans in the garage, and I drug them out, and I put them on this seat, and it let the lawnmower go. And I just rode it and rode it and rode it. One time I crashed it right into a ditch, and somehow I pushed it back over and rode out of the ditch. So I was pretty resourceful. I remember learning to be resourceful from people like my grandparents, my dad, my mom, my aunts and uncles, kind of everyone. I remember that we used an old car hood to go sledding on in the winter. My dad had this idea, well, we've got lots of kids. Why not just put them all on an old car hood? And in fact, we didn't only just use it to slide down as a sled. My dad actually drug us around on it using the car that the hood came off of. So we're kind of like Clampets, I guess. But just learn to be really resourceful, Another thing, not to be stereotypical or cliche, but I loved to bake and I loved interior design right from the beginning. So these are true stories. I would actually fake being sick to my mom so that I could stay home from school, and she'd go off to work. And the moment she left the house, I was out of bed, I had my apron on, and I would bake my way through specifically Grandma Lorraine's cookbook. I was just obsessed with it. I loved it. I wanted to bake. I'd make muffins and cakes and cookies all in one day, and my mother would come home. We'd be out of every baking ingredient, and I would just stand there beaming because, here's our little mini bakery at home. But I took it upon myself to rearrange the furniture anytime she was out of the house. my bedroom, the living room, the dining room. And I look back as a kid, I have no idea how I moved some of these pieces of furniture. I would wedge myself between the wall and I'd use my legs and I'd push and I would move dining hutches, couches, entertainment centers. I was probably 6 or 7. So I've loved baking and interior design from the very beginning. I was also always interested and really captivated by the most curious, random things. So as a kid, we all had our obsessions and things that we really liked. Mine was buses, like school buses, charter buses, anything with a bus. I developed this fascination early. I remember that I won the Best Bus Rider Award in 3rd or 4th grade, and our principal at the time called us up during assembly, and we got these little miniature school buses. And I got home, and we had a big rug on the floor at home. I think it was in the living room, and it had lines on it, like a regular rug or something, a pattern. And I would use the lines and the patterns as roads and drive my bus for hours. I was obsessed with the way that buses moved. I remember that my dad, he's a welder and a mechanic, amongst other things. And we always had big rigs and things at his shop and at our house that he was working on. And one time he had this bus, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven because he let me move it from one side of the work yard to the other. And I was hooked. It was one of the best days ever as a kid. I also was randomly obsessed with RVs and motorhomes. I don't know why. You could ask me as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, and I could tell you this year's best model, what made it different from last year, what it retailed for, where you could find it, what it would be good for. I was obsessed with it to the point that I would actually beg my parents to stop at the RV sales lot. I just wanted to tour RVs. We never really did, but one time I struck gold. I was probably 9 or 10, and I had an aunt, a great aunt, that there was this really luxury coach builder in our area. It was called Beaver Coach. They've since gone out of business, but these motorhomes were $1 million. And my Aunt Marilyn took me to the Beaver Coach show, and heaven, I just looked at every model. I couldn't get over it. And I remember her tapping me on the head saying, "You are so special." I know. Another thing as a kid and now, I really loved adventure. And I mean really loved it. Grew up in the middle of nowhere. We would get home from school, and what would I do? I would get on my 3-wheeler. I knew everything about it. I knew how to start it in the middle of nowhere, fix it, whatever. I just wanted to go. And I explored literally thousands of acres of BLM land behind our property, again in the middle of nowhere, by myself as a little kid. And if it wasn't on the 3-wheeler, it was on the go-kart. And if it wasn't in the go-kart, it was on a 4-wheeler. I loved it. We also, my neighbors had this big white truck. Remember, we drove to the bus because we were normal kids. And there was this dirt road that was not developed. We're talking potholes, ditches, the whole thing. And we would get in the white truck and actually go as fast as we can to hit the bumps. This truck had the springiest seat you've ever seen, ever. And we would bounce and hit our heads on the ceiling of the truck. And we just would laugh for 10 minutes solid. Couldn't stop laughing. Dangerous, but adventurous. And I was just obsessed with it. I was a very resilient little boy. I'm still a pretty resilient guy, but I remember this one time that, again, dangerous / adventurous. My dad was towing me on a sled, this time on the 4-wheeler, and it was a little too dark to be doing it, really. And I hit this boulder and, flipped off the sled and was crying, but I just got right back on. I was resilient. I just kept going, right? I also look back and I don't mean this in a braggy way, but I was a bright little kid. I loved to learn and I loved to be the teacher's pet and demonstrate that I knew what we had learned. I was part of the talented and gifted program at school, and I remember being pulled out of class and meeting up with the other talented and gifted students, and we just felt really special. I won a writing contest once, and I got $100, and that was the most money ever. So I was always a pretty bright little kid, and I always remember my mom and dad telling me, you're so smart, we're so proud of you, keep getting good grades, keep working. So that was really encouraged and cultivated in our house, and I still love to learn today. I also look back and I know that I was definitely a lot more sensitive than the average kid. Doesn't even matter, boy or girl, I was just a sensitive little kid. Things made me cry that it just doesn't make sense why it would make me cry. And I'd be asked by mom, dad, grandma, whoever, why are you crying? And I would just bawl. And I'd say, I don't know. I said that all the time. I don't know. And I would just be crying. I remember watching the movie Titanic with my mom, and I am sure I was too young to be watching this, like I shouldn't have. But I bawled for days. I was like scarred because those people died, and I watched it. And I was always just a really sensitive little kid, and I'm still really sensitive. I've reined it in quite a bit, but still cry all the time. I remember my friends were just as weird and unique as me. One of my best friends from childhood, her name was Ashley. We liked the weirdest things and laughed at the weirdest things, and no one else got it. But we just, all the time, impersonations, voices, all the time. We were just weird kids. I was also, it's, not so weird, but I was obsessed with Legos. And my other childhood best friend, Jason, we would play Legos forever. I mean, you'd have to pry us away. It was, and we took our little toys and we'd do battles with them. And I was, of course, building not, robots and spaceships and things. No, Darren was building buses and motorhomes. Whatever. I was just a weird kiddo. And I also look back and I know that I was definitely a little people pleaser right from the beginning. Since I was a kid, I always wanted to be the first one done on any test from kindergarten to like 12th grade. I wanted to be first done. I wanted to demonstrate that I was the best, that I knew it. I wanted to be the teacher's pet. I'm not super proud of that, but I specifically remember my second grade teacher, Mr. Grant, an amazing man. We were coloring and like drawing from a blank piece of paper, so not just coloring in the lines. And I raced through it. And I ran up to his desk, and I was like, look, I'm done. And he said, I don't think you are, Darren. Let's go add some more. And I'll never forget that. I was like, oh, okay. So I went back and added some, and I probably went to his desk 5 times. And he's like, okay. That's kind of the little kid I was. Obviously, I could keep going on, and there's just countless stories. And we all have those. We have those stories and those memories that we reminisce over and we laugh about. But of course, there are sort of the unpleasant ones. And I think it's important to share those as well sometimes. Not necessarily place blame or use them as an excuse, but, to share them. So some of those sort of unfortunate, not so happy memories that I have from my childhood include things like, I remember growing up in a household where it really didn't seem like we had many rules. At least not the rules of other people. We seemed to just kind of follow our own rules. And it was always weird that whenever we left our house or we weren't with our family, we knew that our rules needed to be paused, and we were going to, go by the rules of everyone else. And I say that because it's almost like we were chameleons. I don't know if that's going to totally make sense, but I really specifically remember that, and I didn't love it. I always felt like I needed to be somebody else, if that makes sense. Another thing is that I was brought up to feel like everything was sort of a competition between us and just everyone else. and filled with all these reasons why we were better, we had a better way, we knew better. And I look back and, being proud is one thing, but not really giving consideration or accolade to other people and what they're good at and their talents and just the whole gamut is kind of crossing that line of being confident to being arrogant. And I look back and I know that was definitely a part of my childhood. My dad would always say things like, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And, it was always a competition, it seemed like. It was almost this war, like us against them and whose way is better. So, for example, instead of hiring things out, we just, or getting help, really, for anything from professionals or people that were good at that, like, we didn't hire them. We did everything ourselves because there was, like, almost something to prove. Like, it's a competition. And a lot of those projects that we would embark upon, like, they didn't get completed. They were, and if they did, they probably weren't done the best that they could have been a lot of the time. So it was always weird to feel like we're in a competition, just always, and on every subject. A lot of people say that they grow up poor, and sometimes people say, we were comfortable or middle class. That means different things to different people. I don't even know if we were poor per se. I think we were poor. But I remember that we talked about money all the time and how we didn't have enough of it. We wanted more. And we didn't have a lot of money. And I just remember I was the only kid that did extracurricular activities. And I was always kind of made to feel bad about it in a way. Not directly, but indirectly and kind of passive. Just money was in every single conversation. And it felt weird. And looking back, it's like, I just kind of wonder why that is. But it was definitely there. Things in our house were seen, said, and heard in our house that nobody else was allowed to know about. I very specifically remember being told by both my parents that our business is our business. And, like, you don't share that. So as a kid, it creates this idea of, like, oh, I wonder why. And then you cling to that when you're out and about with friends, you're in public, just in general, like, oh, I'm not supposed to talk about that. And we lived in the middle of nowhere, and I'm pretty sure that was intentional. My dad could do whatever he wanted. My mom could do whatever she wanted. And we were told specifically not to talk about what happened at home a lot of the times when we weren't at home. So I remember that. And I remember that, especially with my mother, perfection and a good image were kind of everything. And we needed to do our best to achieve both. We were brought up to be super, like, hyper aware of how we dressed, how we acted, how we looked, how we were perceived. And I don't know if that's good or bad. I think it's good to have aspirations and goals, but we were definitely told to look the part of, the part, whatever that was. Another thing is that my brother, sister, and I, we were punished by our parents in a very different way than our friends were punished by their parents. And that included a lot of physical and emotional and verbal abuse. It was very common to just, get a whack on the head or a slap and be yelled at. It was, I'm not even here to have a conversation about whether that's right or wrong. I just knew that we were punished very, very differently than my friends were. I remember one time a friend was over and I got in trouble for something, and who's to say I didn't deserve it, but I did. And I got hit. And my friend said, wow, my parents would never do that. And it really, it sparked this thought, oh, really? Another thing that was really unfortunate from our childhood is that my parents, who are divorced now, they did not treat each other all that great for most of the time, the majority of the time. A lot of yelling, a lot of hitting, screaming, throwing things, name calling, you name it. It just they didn't treat each other all that great. And we really took that on as kids, and we wondered if it was our fault. Could we do something different? It was just definitely a thing that happened. And another thing that I've really thought about is that we had and did all the things that other families had and did, but ours always seemed to be more complicated. And it's kind of going in with the way my parents treated each other. But it also just seemed like maybe we were unlucky. We'd be on vacation and the car would break down and cause a big fight. Or my mother was adamant about having dinner on the table every night at 6. And if anything infringed upon that, it was trouble. There was yelling, there was anger. It was just, it just seems like we did things that other families did, but it was always a little more complicated, and it didn't go the way I thought that it should. And I guess that thinking the way it should go thing kind of came from being around my friends and being in other homes growing up, like just and observing how they did things. And the last thing that I would mention is that we did grow up very spiritual, and God and the church, specifically the Church of Christ, were definitely a part of our childhood. But looking back, it really only seems like they were on Sunday morning and during the prayer before dinner every night. But also to shame us. God was kind of used as this thing to instill fear or get us to do better. God would not be pleased with you, or there was just kind of this weird thing around God, and it wasn't necessarily to fill us with joy per se. It was definitely much more of like this fear thing. So there was a lot of tension in our house growing up, and a lot of uncomfortable situations and experiences, and mostly just a lot of insecurity about who we were, who we were supposed to be, how we were supposed to act, and all of that. Now look, I don't intend this to be some huge complaint fest about my childhood. And it's not an opportunity for me to place blame on my parents and say that they did a really bad job. That's not what this is. I want you to consider this. This is what I've been thinking on. Whenever somebody that we know passes away, like they leave this earth, whether it's expected or unexpected, we almost always instantly forget all of the maybe bad or negative things that they did in their life that maybe we didn't like or we didn't approve of or spoke to their reputation. It almost all goes away. And we remember all of the good things. So I've been thinking, why do we do that? I Googled it even, and I found some really interesting answers. I don't know if y'all do it, but I do. When someone passes away, it's just like, I just immediately start creating this list of how great they were, even if maybe, I'm going to be bold and say this, even if maybe they weren't that great. We do this all the time. So my childhood was certainly full of ups and downs, fortunate and unfortunate circumstances, you name it. And I'm betting that you have all of the same stories. However, one of the biggest mistakes that I've made since my childhood is you take that idea of when someone passes away and we remember the good. I heavily concentrated on sort of the unfortunate, the bad parts, the parts that I wish had been a different way. And for whatever reason, and I do know the reason, but I for whatever reason, I would always share the downs before any of the ups whenever I was talking to people about my childhood throughout my teenage years and into my early 20s. And it was because I knew that by sharing those stories, the downs and the sad parts, that I would receive that compassion and that attention that I had described I wanted whenever I talked about my birth. I really struggled with wanting to be loved in my teens and early 20s. And as this story goes on, you'll sort of understand why that came about. And it hasn't been until recently, within the last couple of years, that I really realized the harm that I was inflicting upon myself by viewing my childhood the way that I did. So by only concentrating and sharing the parts of my childhood that were difficult for me, as I shared in my story about the birth, I was definitely making myself the victim. And that's very harmful for me. Some people have been the victim, and maybe they're not in a place in their life to sort of change that. Maybe they have no desire to, maybe they don't need to. But that's not for me to answer. And I know that being the victim was very harmful for me. So, as I mentioned in my story about the birth, I don't want to be known as the victim. I'm much more interested in being known as the champion, someone who's succeeding. And it is subjective, of course. I know that I could probably get a lot of responses and comments about that specifically, but it goes back to that definition of what a victim is. It's someone who was hurt, harmed, or killed as the result of a crime, accident, or other situation. So, my childhood was tougher than a lot of people's, and I know that a lot of you have the same sort of scenario, a little tougher than the average childhood. But I also know that it was much fuller and much richer and much more experiential, full of experiences, much more than the average childhood. And to sort of tie all this together, I'm more interested in where I'm headed in this life than where I've been. And I know that we can use the experiences of where we've been to determine where we're going. And that's what I'm doing. Because of that, I choose to remember and appreciate the good, the positive, the memorable, the joy. There was a lot of that in my childhood. And where I have been has led me to where I am today and inspired me for where I'm headed tomorrow. And getting to this point, this relationship with my childhood and my take on it has not been easy. I've had to have very deep conversations with myself, my parents, other individuals in my childhood, God, all of them. I have experienced all of the emotions that one can experience: sadness, anger, frustration, vulnerability, understanding, happiness, joy, peace, and especially joy and peace. Because by going through all of the motions, I've forgiven. I've been forgiven. I've shared and I've been shared with. I've listened and I have been listened to. And mostly I have loved and been loved through this experience. Nobody is taught how to parent. Google how to parent or how to be a good parent. And oh my word, there's a lot of ideas on what that looks like and what that means. And after a lot of conversations and discussion, I absolutely know that my parents did the best that they knew how to do. And I'm not here to say whether that was good enough or not. They know the mistakes that they made. I know the mistakes I made. There's a time when you're a little kid when you know what's right and wrong. I mean, we do. We know this. My point is, we've talked about it. Apologies have been granted. Forgiveness has been given on both sides. And above all, I'm just thankful that I've had the opportunity to really get clear on my childhood. And I'm telling you all this, and I'm writing this book because I want everyone to experience this sort of peace and joy that I've received. If any of you has anything that you struggle today with that stemmed from your childhood, my advice is to address it. All of it. Have the conversations that you know need to be had with yourself, with those that you know you need to talk to. And when you do talk, when you're ready, it's hard. It's going to take a lot of courage, but when you're ready, if someone says, "Why are you bringing this up? Why do you want to talk about the past?" Be vulnerable and say, "Because it's something that I need. It's something that I'm working through." Be considerate. Ask open-ended questions. Who, what, where, when, why, how. Be patient. Be patient with yourself. Be patient with others. Working through all of this has taken a lot of time and energy. And it was a slow-going process. I'm a very impatient guy, and I had to really take my time and be patient and understand that it was a process. But it completely pays off. When you hit an impasse, working through your childhood, answering these questions, figuring it out, whatever that looks like for you, if you even need it at all, when you hit those roadblocks, don't just go around them. And don't even try to just climb over them and skip it. Work through it. Work through what needs to be worked through. And if there really isn't a solution and you are at an impasse or it's harming you, it's not healthy, then forge a different path. But the point is that you will have tried. If I hadn't learned to respect and appreciate my childhood the way that I do today, I would have never, ever had the ability to move on the way that I have with so many parts of my life. And I especially wouldn't have gotten to a point to be able to write about it like this, to be able to write this whole book. And there's going to be a lot more stories about my childhood, the good and the bad, as I continue on with this project. But overall, I'm really thankful for my childhood, all of it. And mostly, I'm just grateful that it's made me into who I am today. So that is my episode about the childhood. Probably some work to do here, and but it's what I came up with. Thank you so much for watching this. If you've watched through to the whole thing to the end, I really appreciate it. Again, all of the comments and just words of inspiration have been so encouraging to me, and I'm just going to keep on keeping on. So my next episode is going to be a really interesting one. Episode 4, Chapter 3 is called The Mom, and it will be ready by next Wednesday. So with that, again, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good day.